So today I want to talk about the Supreme Court striking down the CDC eviction moratorium. The news of the eviction moratorium being struck down by the Supreme Court should not come as a surprise to anyone who's been following this topic. As I covered the last time I talked about this, the Supreme Court only allowed the previous moratorium to continue because it only had a few weeks remaining. With the Biden administration extending it through October 3rd with this new moratorium, it was only a matter of time until someone challenged it and the conservative justices struck it down. So here we are. We're now in a place where at least 11 million Americans are now at risk for losing their homes. This comes as the Delta variant is spreading faster, and as we approach the autumn and winter months where evictions are now likely to occur in much colder weather. Meanwhile, only about $5 billion of the $46 billion allocated for rental assistance have made it into people's hands. Things are about to get really bad out there. People are going to get sick in much larger amounts, hospitals are going to overflow, and likely, people are going to die. And for those lucky enough to have family or places to go after they're evicted, they are going to end up in much denser living situations, which will assist in the spread of the virus. And for those who are not as fortunate, they will likely end up homeless. And honestly, I think we need to have a conversation about the failings of government, who's at risk during all of these evictions, the position of landlords and how they relate to tenants, and what we need to do going forward. Well, when it comes to the government failing, we have to start by talking about the system itself. As much as it would be great to point blame at a specific individual, it's not about individuals. And even though I do believe some individuals enable things more and are clearly more culpable than others, it really starts with the systemic issues, and it starts before the pandemic even started, as there was no proper plan ever put in place to plan for a pandemic. There was no storage or warehouse of PPE. There was no government plan to test people, to mobilize healthcare professionals, to hire people to work on testing sites. None of it. There was no financial incentive for the government to provide these things or for private interests to do the same. And beyond that, in our current situation, we're now looking at a Supreme Court, an unelected body of 9 individuals, many of whom were placed into power by presidents who didn't even have the full extent of popular vote, claiming a decision made by medical professionals designed to medically protect people is unconstitutional, primarily due to its effect on landlords' profit margins. And their solution is to tell Congress that they must enact a law if protections are to continue. And meanwhile, that very same Congress is static and unmoving and unable to pass anything that's actually providing protections or relief for people. On the surface, that's because of the filibuster, and because certain senators won't remove it. But largely, under the table, under the surface of everything, that's because of the corporate donors who finance many of those politicians, removing any of the remaining semblance of a democracy the United States pretends to have. On top of it all, the bureaucracy of many states can't even get any of the money together into people's hands fast enough to prevent evictions. If we look at the data here, while the Treasury Department is overseeing the program, it's up to states and local governments to set up systems to process applications, screen tenants, and distribute aid. The amount that's been dispersed varies greatly by state. Emergency funds are allocated to each state based on their populations. And given all of that, money has begun to trickle out to renters as of January, but more than half of the payment states have reported that they didn't start really giving out a large sum of the portions until June. Oregon had delays in establishing its program. The state only had distributed $2.7 million in June, but reported that more than $10 million distributed in July. New York State hadn't paid out any of its $800 million as of June, but paid $2.7 million in July. That's $2.7 million out of $800 million. And while Virginia and Texas have done a lot more to get some of that money out, still many of them have not even hit a decent percentage. And if you look at the screen right now, if you look at what I'm showing here from the Wall Street Journal, it's a marker to show the percentage of which states have actually paid off what percentages. So each of the dots represents a single percent. So you have some states that have gone just over 1% of the funds, like New York. You have states like California that are maybe sitting in the, what is that, like 22% range, maybe, at most. And this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with, where some states, what is this? Alabama has one, two, three, four, five, it's like 6%. And that's not enough. None of this money is getting into the hands of people fast enough. And what this really boils down to is who this is affecting. The fact that these people are not getting the money. Most of the money that they need is going to end up in the hands of landlords at the end of the day. That's true. But at least that will keep people in their homes for now. We have some information about the household rental debt. And this comes out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And this is one of the more conservative estimates I've come across, which states that 5.8% of renter households are in debt, up to 1.95 million renter households are brought into that, almost 2 million renter households that have over $15.3 billion in debt, which means that on average, people have about $7,800 in debt. And again, this is one of the more conservative estimates. If we look at National Equity Atlas, we find a lot more disturbing values and numbers. As of the first week of July 2021, 6.4 million renters, 15% of all renter households, were behind on their rent payments. And as we go through this, we find that they estimate the rent debt to be about $21 billion, and that the average amount owed depends primarily on local housing costs, which makes sense given that rent prices change. If you're in a larger city like, say, LA, Chicago, New York, you're going to have a much higher amount than if you're in a different area that has much lower rents. But among states, Hawaii has the highest average rent debt per behind household with $5,600, while Arkansas has the lowest with $2,100. At the metro level, San Francisco and Washington, D.C. have the highest average debts with $5,800 and $5,200 respectively, while Detroit has the lowest average debt by far with $2,500, followed by Phoenix with $3,200. These are large amounts of debt. And given that before the pandemic, most households could not afford a $500, let alone a $1,000 emergency, this should tell you where people are at. A lot of people who rent are going to end up in these really bad spots where they can't afford to pay back. And rent is not the only debt that's accumulating for all these renters. It's worth noting as well that they not only have back payments on rent, but on other utilities, on any medical expenses, car payments, and so many other things, including credit cards, which of course just add to the debt. And sometimes you use the credit card to try to pay off one of the utilities or one of the car payments or maybe even your rent, and that just starts accruing more interest over time. Now, it's worth noting that renters of color have, of course, been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and are more likely to owe back rent, making them more vulnerable to eviction risk. Atlas data shows that 7 in 10 white households actually own their homes, while the majority of Black, Latinx, and multiracial households rent, which means this is, of course, disproportionately affecting people of color and not white people as much. Today, 24% of Black renters, 17% of Asian or Pacific Island and Latinx renters, and 18% of multiracial renters are behind on rent compared to only 9% of white renters. And here we have that today's rent crisis is a microcosm of the wretched inequality of the pandemic. Millions of renter households, most of them people of color, now face the burden of owing back rent due to a public health crisis that has had extremely concentrated negative economic impacts on low-wage workers. These unequal consequences are not random, but the predictable result of past policies that left millions of families with no savings to draw upon in the face of an economic shock, as well as the failed early policy response to the pandemic. And this is what I was getting at with it being systemic. A lot of the people who rent and a lot of the people who are struggling because of previous economic outcomes. which were caused in part by the system at large. People who are in these places, who are working low-wage jobs, many of which, again, are people of color, are the ones who are bearing the burden and the full force of this public health crisis. And on top of that, when we look at who's not able to pay their rent, we're seeing that, again, 24% of Black renters are struggling. The majority of renters are not white. That should tell you something. So in addition to this, for an equitable and just recovery, the argument is that policymakers needed to make clear rent debt and prevent eviction. They must clear the rent debt and prevent eviction, rather. And that's not happening here. That's clearly not. As we've seen, as I talked about, that is not going to occur. Now, Forbes has a few more bits of data that are worth looking at. The states with the highest share of people behind on rent, according to them: Mississippi with 29% of its rental population, South Carolina with 28%, and Georgia with 24%, totaling 157,000, 265,000, and 563,000 people, respectively. South Carolina had all but 4 counties had at least 1 in 5 behind on rent, while 6 had almost a third of their renters lagging on payments. This is according to the Washington, D.C. based nonprofit Sergo Ventures. The CDC data indicated at least 4 other states have 20% or more of their renters at risk, including Indiana, West Virginia, New York, and Connecticut, even though the latter 2 states still have protections from renters being booted immediately on a local and state level rather than the federal one. Meanwhile, Texas, New York, and California had all over 1 million renters who reported falling behind on payments, comprising 15, 21, and 14% of their total populations. And this is where we're at in all of this. This is who's being affected, and this is how many people are really desperate at this time with these back payments on rent. And even if the money does get into people's hands, yes, they are going to be able to pay the landlords an extensive amount of money in order to get out of some of that debt. But that's not going to affect their other debts, and that's still going to leave people in rather desperate places. The good news is that, again, at the very least, they will have a roof over their head. So with all of this in mind, and all of these people likely to be at risk for eviction, we come to this position where we really do have to talk about landlords. Landlords are the ones who brought the suit to the Supreme Court. Landlords have been the ones complaining about the eviction moratorium and how they're not getting their money in their proper due in terms of payments. They are the ones who got this overturned. They are the ones who have been fighting this. And I think that when we talk about all of this, the dissenting opinion of Justice Breyer explains the power differential quite well and really provides, at the very least, the most basic argument for why this is a problem. So we have here in the dissenting opinion from the Supreme Court, the balance of equities strongly favor leaving the stay in place. That's the eviction moratorium. Leave it in place. Applicants say they've lost thousands of dollars in rental income. That injury is lessened by the moratorium's orders directive that tenants have an obligation to make as close to full rent payment as possible. And to compensate for the shortfall, Congress has appropriated more than $46.5 billion to help pay rent and rental arrears. This is part of the American Rescue Plan, of course. It may, as applicants say, take time to get money, and that is an injury. But compare that to the injury, to the irreparable harm from vacating the stay. COVID-19 transmission rates have spiked in recent weeks, reaching levels that the CDC puts as high as last winter, 150,000 new cases per day. To date, the CDC estimates that 38 million Americans have been sickened, 629,000 have died. This week, the CDC calculates averages of new daily hospital admissions at 12,209. New admissions of patients confirmed with COVID-19. The number of patients hospitalized with COVID-19 is up 13.3% from last week. and the CDC prevalent hospitalization of patients with confirmed that they were in fact COVID-19. Look back at the order's criteria for temporary eviction relief. The CDC, the new moratorium this is, targets only those people who have nowhere else to live in areas with dangerous levels of community transmission. These people may end up with relatives in shelters or seeking beds in other congregant facilities where the doubly contagious Delta variant threatens to spread quickly. The Delta variant is seen to be about 2 times as contagious as the previous variants, with more severe illness than previous strains in unvaccinated persons. Absent the current state, the CDC projects a strong likelihood of mass evictions nationwide, with public health consequences that would be difficult to reverse. Meanwhile, the public interest is not favored by the spread of the disease or a court's second-guessing of the CDC's judgment. The CDC has determined that a surge in evictions could lead to the immediate and significant movement of large numbers of persons from low-density to high-density housing. When the highly transmittable Delta variant is driving COVID cases at unprecedented rates, the CDC cites models showing up to 30% increase of contracting COVID-19 for some evicted people, those who share housing with them after the displacement. The CDC invokes studies finding nationally over 433,000 cases and over 10,000 deaths may be traced to lifting the state eviction moratoria. That is absurd. We are talking about a situation where thousands of dollars in rent from tenants is being placed against the reality that people will get sick in mass, that there will be 10,000 deaths at the very least, and close to 433,000 cases due to ending this. And we are worried about a few $1,000s in rent payments that will be a little bit late, because the government is still covering the landlords. And this is really what it comes down to, and it has always come down to in the situation of landlords. You have a situation where their property, their investment in second, third, fifth, 25th houses, apartments, rental spaces, are being prioritized over the first home of people. Yes, it will be a shame, I guess, for these landlords if they have to give up all of, a number of these rental properties in order to continue to exist. But that is what will happen. If a landlord fails on their investment, they become an employee like everybody else. They have to go get a regular job. When a tenant during the pandemic is evicted, they lose their only home. They lose the place that they live. And the difference there in value, in what they're experiencing, is drastically different. What the society as a whole is losing in removing this eviction moratorium is far greater than a few $1,000s going to a landlord. And that is the disturbing reality in all of this. They are more worried, these landlords, about losing this little bit of money rather than the safety of a society and all of these lives. I guess it's really not their problem. And yes, you could argue that the government should step in and provide the money. Well, they are. The states are slow on it, sure, but they are providing that money. And it's not the tenants who are going to see that money. It is the landlords. And that cannot be emphasized enough. The power differential is drastic in these cases. And so when we talk about all of this and we look at all this, we have to call into question, what do we do going forward? Well, and I need to say this up front, none of this is legal advice. I can't offer any sort of legal advice going forward. But if you find yourself in a place where you're behind on payments and are fearful of losing your home, try to apply for rental assistance if you haven't already. And if you have, try to seek out information on what's going on with it and why it hasn't ended up in your hands yet. The process, at the very least, applying for it and all that, may provide at least some legal protections in certain cases. However, I wouldn't rely on it exclusively. Depending on your landlord, and again, this is up to the landlord's subjective opinion on things and what they want to do, you could try to reach out to them if you feel secure enough to do so and see if you can work something out and try to keep your home. Having more people stay in their homes during the course of this continued pandemic through the Delta variant will benefit the society as a whole. And I would, more than anything else, start reaching out to your neighbors and any tenant associations in your area if they exist and if you're capable. This is going to be a time where we need serious mutual aid and care for one another. because things are about to get really rough. Try to stand by each other, try to be there through the emotional hardships, and try to keep people in their homes. The longer people are in their homes, the harder it is for people to get evicted. And the unfortunate reality in all of this is that the government, it's failed people. And protecting property over people is what the government is doing. Landlords are having their investments in these rental properties protected at the cost of people who call those properties home, who need those spaces in order to live in. That is absurd and ridiculous that we are talking about somebody's investment versus somebody's actual housing and roof over their head and comparing the two as if they are somehow comparable, especially during a pandemic like this. And this is happening because a pandemic is making it so much worse, and we were not prepared in any way for it. And as people are likely to be evicted in some of the coldest months of the year, where people are going to end up homeless in some of the coldest weather available in the country, and as you have cities that have already declared it essentially illegal, like Los Angeles, to be homeless, this is going to make for a terribly rough and bad situation, and that is the understatement of all things. This is the reality we find ourselves in, and this is where we are. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.